Hey guys, today we're going to talk about trees, which is a huge part of our current project, and I wanted to make sure that when you go into this problem, you don't get totally lost. One of the first things that often happens is you think, okay, I'm going to make a tree. How does that happen? You start Googling, it is just obfuscated data, it's hard to understand, and so I wanted to make sure you had a good template file that gave you a full gamut of all the ways that trees can be made in 3D. And so you would have a good understanding of all the ways you could possibly do it and pick the ones that would make a good process for you. So the first thing you should do is, if you look over here on Canvas, under Files, you can get nature.7z and unzip that, and there's going to be a file in there called Tree Presets. And all of these different first objects in this center row are going to have on their first data, on their first node in the attribute editor, a note on all the information on how they were created. So hopefully you'll be able to dig through this and reverse engineer the process and make your own trees that are looking good. So I wanted to talk about all the different ways that trees get made, from the lowest low poly style to the highest high poly style, because you never know which one is the best mark for your production, and you have to be able to think flexibly about that sort of thing. So let's start by talking about what you shouldn't do, which is, first off, we have this low poly layer, and I think these trees are oftentimes they look good, but they're not very ambitious. So I would like, if it's possible, that you do something a little more ambitious than using these. It's just, it takes very little effort to make them, and there's some core competencies I want you to get in making trees like this that I don't think you get with those other ones. So you should be able to, make a tree out of lots and lots of cards, have it feel organic and look good. And then similarly, on the high poly level, over here we have a tree, and all this tree is a freaking paint effect. All you have to do to make this is display, window, general editors, visor, and you scroll down to trees, and you select a tree, and there you go, tree. The problem with this kind of tree is that it requires zero artistry. It requires very little technical knowledge, so I want to make sure that you're going with something more ambitious than a paint effect tree, because you don't learn anything about this, and also these paint effect trees are largely unusable in the majority of situations that you're going to face. Only if you're in a huge Hollywood budget where you're actually probably using something more expensive and personalized than paint effects are you going to find them useful. And then you have these middle trees, which do in fact use paint effects, or if you're in Blender, there's the sapling plugin, which you can get to Control-Alt-U to get to your add-ons, and search sapling. And this gives you a tree generator, very much like paint effects. And these are just ways that you can make a tree that will let you do something that's largely generated and largely mathematical, which that's the way things grow in nature. So it looks good and it saves you time. And if you're doing it right, you can convert it into a useful file. So let's talk about some of these early ones, these low poly trees. If we look at their notes, they will tell you a lot about themselves. So for instance, this mesh is just a 1x1 plane, that's it. And its texture is just an alpha channel targa. And one thing that does happen in it is, you can read in the descriptions, but it's specifically one of the things you have to do with it is switch its filter type to off so that you get that nice pixel look. Also, in the materials of this tree, you'll notice a couple changes from the normal material. For instance, ambient color is set to pure white, and then under ray trace options, shadow attenuation is dropped to 0. And what shadow attenuation means is whether a tree's alpha shows up or not. So actually, this is a bad example of shadow attenuation. Perhaps one of these is better. Turning on the lights, Blender crash. Yeah. So shadow attenuation, you can't see it in Viewport 2.0, but you can see it in Legacy Viewport. And what it is whether alpha is getting calculated for your shadows. And so it's not really necessary on this low poly tree. However, it's good to know about for alpha, and this tree does use alpha. Why doesn't this tree cast a shadow? Well, the technical reason is because I want to save resources. Lights and shadows are expensive, so I have purposely turned them off. And how did I do that is with the light linking editor. So if you go to rendering, lighting, shading, light linking editor, you have light centric and object centric. And what these mean is what is the object you're thinking about as the parental object that's defining the relationship. And so right now I'm not thinking about the 30 lights in this scene. I'm just thinking about this one tree and how I don't want anything lighting it. So I'm going to go with object centric. Now when you open this, you get your list of inputs on the left and your list of objects on the left and your list of lights on the right. And if you select one of these, you can see what light linking does. All it does is say, if this object is selected over here, it's going to be viewed by it's going to be affected by all the lights that are selected over here. So that's it. So if I wanted this tree sprite to have no lights, all I did is I went over and I clicked these to be blank. Now these are no longer affecting it. Again, look through these notes, and you'll probably discover some good ideas about how to mess with this stuff. These other objects are different in that these low poly trees are often going to be useful if you were in a low poly scenario where you might need to just not make textures because you don't want to budget for them. And I mean budget both on the rendering intensity side and on the production side. It might be too costly to make. And so this is a way that you can make something that's stylized and kind of appealing, even though it doesn't have any textures representing it. Now one thing that's tricky with this is I could have made this with two materials, one that's green for up here and brown for up here. But I just wanted to express the concept of vertex colors really fast, because it's something that you see in a lot of programs and a lot of workflows as a way to control data. Now Maya has one of the worst interfaces for using vertex colors, but it is useful. So if you look at the material on this, material attributes, it's a surface shader, and there's not a lot special going on, but the color is hooked up via vertex colors using the node editor. So let's really quick look at the vertex colors. If I go to polygons menu, under color you have the paint vertex color tool and the color set editor. If you open up the color set editor, you can see which vertex group you're looking at, COL. Now if I went to paint vertex color, I could open this and change the value to something like red, and then just start adding red. The reason vertex colors are useful is you have a RGB value of 100 representing red for this single vertex over here and this single vertex over here. This differs from representing, that's 66 vertices total in this tree. If you were to use a texture that was 128 by 128, that's way more pixels than there are vertices. So why not just use the vertices as the data? And oftentimes you also end up using this to combine textures. So next up is the hard part, which is hooking it up in the node editor. The node editor is the bottom part that you see in the hypershade. I'm just going to operate right out of here. And the first thing you'll want to do is go to the material attributes, select your material here, and then graph that nowhere, and you can see it. And you'll notice that there's some strange hookups up here. Let's see if I can regraph this really fast. I'm going to save just because it's obtuse enough that it's totally possible I messed this up. So first off, I'm going to delete this node and remap this. And so if I have this selected, and again I map the vertex material, so I'll select that and map its inputs. The first thing I need is all of the inputs that are going to affect it. So I have to add nodes that represent things in my scene. First I'll add the shape node for this tree. So if I go over here in the shape node, I can say select, and then over here this plus button will add it as a node. Whee! And now this is something that can affect anything else. You can hook anything from over here over there. The next thing we need is a vertex node that represents where those vertex colors are. So I'll hit tab and type in vertex. This lets you search for nodes, and we can see one of the first things that comes up is mental ray vertex colors. This is the tricky part. You would think that the first indexed material would just be the first one it goes to, but that's not true. You have to manually add it. So over here with this vertex color node selected, I can hit add new item, and I need to represent the namespace of that node that I created. So over here in the color set editor, when I created when I started painting on this, it got a node called COL for color, and that is going to be our mysterious little vertex color. So over here in CPV1, I'll type in COL, and you need that so that it knows what to set up. And this is the part where Maya might break. Next up, I need to connect these. And you would think that, like other nodes, you could just click and drag, or say, go here, color set 0. Color set 0. Color set 0, and hook it up over here. But you can't. They're considered nodes that don't talk to each other, even though this is a very basic process in most other software. So instead what you have to do is use the connection editor. So if you've never used the connection editor, it's actually why Maya is considered so powerful, because it lets you control any object or value in Maya with any other object or value. So I will go General Editors, Connection Editor, and with this tree geometric shape node over here, I will reload left, and my vertex colors over here, I will reload right. This lets me say what's my inputs and outputs, and I want the tree to be my input, so I will reverse these. So over here I have my tree. It's good to go options, attribute order, alphabetical. And next we need to hook this color set up to something. So it's color set 0. And we're trying to hook it up into the color gain. Maybe not. Maybe they do need to be flipped. I think that's what I want. Again, clearly not a simple process. And then, lastly, you want to hook this mental ray vertex color into your tree. So then you would hook your out color into the color of this. Let's see if that worked. Nope, need a light in this. Nope, did not work. Alright, I'll have to play with this one more. If you're doing it in Blender, it's super easy. I know you guys hate when I say that, but all you have to do is, if you have an object that has vertex colors on it, and it has a material, all you do is you say, right down here under options, instead of using whatever you have hooked up texture wise and diffuse wise, you just say vertex color paint equals the color of this mesh, and then it'll work. Unity is also simple. I don't know why Maya makes it hard, but it's important to know that when you get to other platforms, it's something that happens a lot. So the next thing that's worth knowing about on the low poly trees is these guys, which are just alpha cards. And they were very simple to make. All I did is, in Photoshop, let's see if I can find that texture. I went on CG Cookie, or not CG Cookie, CG Textures, or the internet or something. And somehow you find a tree like this, right? And one problem here is, right off the bat, this is a giant texture and it's not the proper size. So I did end up just making a separate file, and what I ended up doing on this one, I'll redo it just to show you the process, is first we want to make a selection that is just this tree texture. So what I ended up doing is you can look at your channels and often find the one that has the highest contrast, and that's often the best way to make your selection. So if I do find it, I can click on it, or rather control click on it, and make any one of these my selection. So I'll control click on the blue channel, which has the most contrast, and that'll become my selection. I'll then turn all these back on, and then on the layers palette, I'll duplicate this, so I'm working on something non-destructibly. I will invert my selection and delete. Never mind. I don't invert my selection, and I delete. And now I have this tree that deleted wrong, but you'll notice it didn't really work. So let's look at that instead in the quick mask mode. Now if you go over here, you can see that when you hit Q you enter quick mask mode, which gives you a pixelate representation of your selections. And on the channels you can make sure you're looking at just that by turning off RGB. So now we can modify this specifically as a selection as if it were an image. So the first thing I would do is make this a more high contrast image, so that my blacks are black and my whites are white, something like that. And then additionally, I might just, because I know that a lot of this is not something I want, I go over here and select a lot of this junk and turn it white. That's pretty good. So now, when I hit Q again to exit my quick mask, which sends me back into RGB, I'll go from channels to layers, and now when I hit delete, you'll notice my tree is really good. And I like to test my edge pixels by putting a really vibrantly colored violent thing next to them, or behind them. So next up, we have to turn this into a targa, which will use an alpha channel to represent alpha and a color channel to represent color. And this is one of those small things that it's hard to understand until you've messed it up on a production, but you have to get your colors correct as they transfer to transparent. So when this is like 0.1%, it won't show up as green, even though it's fading from green. It'll end up starting to represent that as black or white, especially when programs are trying to save memory on alpha and clip it. So what you end up doing is making it a solid color background. At this point, actually, what I would do is create my 1024 by 1024, and I would select all this, copy it, paste it in here. Scale it down to something like that. Also, I'm going to add a center line around 256 so that I know where I want to set the center of my trunk. So now, when I move this trunk around, I can say this is the center of the polygon. And that's useful later when you're doing things like, let's say you're duplicating this all around on an alpha card, and it can all start from the same layer. So it's just good practice. So as I was saying, how do we make this a solid green background? Well, I could just color pick off of this and fill this, but there's a way to get an even better selection. And also when you do that, you'll notice there is still a little too much blue here. So what I would do is use the solidify filter. Now this doesn't exist normally. It's a flaming pear freebie. So if you go to Google, and I put all the notes in the nodes of those objects in the Maya file, go flaming pear, and you can find it. It's in the download section, free section, and for all I know, Photoshop just has something like this built in now. But there you go. You would just stick that, you would follow the instructions and put that in your filters folder. So with the Flexify filter, what you can do is get an even better background. And first off, I don't want any of these blue pixels. So I would start by selecting this whole layer. I can select its contents by control clicking it. I can shrink the selection, or in this case, looks like expand is what I want. So I'll expand a little. Oh, shrink. I have hotkeys assigned to expand and contract. We'll contract by 2. That looks pretty good. Control Shift invert and delete. And now, on this one, I've deleted most of those blue pixels, so that when I go filter, flaming pear, solidify, not Flexify, I get it gradients out in a way that really fits the tree. And you'll notice there's still some blue. You could maybe select by color balance, or select by color range to get rid of all of it, but it's looking pretty good. And I might even just leave this layer off, but use it to make an alpha channel. So to make an alpha channel, I would just create a new channel while I have that selected. I don't know where that big circle came from. And that would be how you made a tree sprite. Again, in Maya, you can go to the first node and read more about all these. And there's a couple things I do once again on the material. So the color and transparency is just ticked up. I oftentimes increase translucence for trees so that they're shadowed on both sides equally. And again, under ray trace options, taking shadow attenuation down to 0 is a good way to fix that. Here's some other options that show how you can build out these sort of old school trees in a way that fleshes them out. One is you can duplicate that card multiple times. And another, it doesn't draw well here because, again, Maya is not good at drawing. But you can also put a sphere in the middle of it that sort of blocks all that stuff off. And then the alpha cards are just to give you the profile view of these plants coming out. So lastly, this tree is an example of an alternative in making your alpha cards a little more interesting. This is representing that, again, that weird little tree over here that just juts out on mine. And close all these. And so this was just the same idea of a card, but with some subdivisions. And because the card starts at that center line for the trunk, I was able to add divisions and sort of in vertex mode. I can then use the B key to turn on. I can use the B key to turn off, or turn off and on, gradient select. And if you hold B and middle mouse, you can drag the amount of it, and then just sort of make it look interesting. And again, same ideas. It has information on how to make it. This one is an example of one that had shadelessness because I didn't want any of that junk on there. I think it's got shadelessness. It might be a typo. Yeah, ambient color set to 1, diffuse is set to 0. So no lights affecting this. And again, Maya draws it bad. I don't know why, but there. IPR render. But this still didn't look very good, and I think it's an example of where you need to start using more polygons. And that's where we get to some of the higher poly options. So this is an example of one. Let's turn off the low poly one. Now for the high poly trees, you then start wanting to get into the realm of using procedural tools to generate your trees using curves. And then from there, making them a little bit by hand. Again, Maya draws these so hideously. But so a tree like this can be made pretty quickly using something like Paint Effects to generate your mesh. And the problem is, Paint Effects is so huge, and most generators are like that. They're trying to cater to both the low end and the massively high end, high budget Hollywood films at the same time. And we don't want those massive high poly options. So it's important to understand how to turn Paint Effects off. If you click on this farthest back one, that's a little better. But it still does that weird, like, not able to sort the distance. Ugh. So again, if you go to this farthest back one, on its first node, it has a description of how this was made. And the starting point is creating a curve. Now what Paint Effects does, if you've ever just opened up the visor, general editor's visor, and you just grab a tree. It's important to note that you're actually not drawing a tree from the trunk. You're drawing it from the branches. And let me explain that. So if I have this redwood tree, and I just draw it out here, it's going to draw one tree for every X amount of distance on your stroke. Some of these have better placement than others, which is why it ends up getting used for grass as well. That's a good one. Yeah. So this is an example of how it grows. Now under the hood, what you're doing is first you're generating a stroke, which you would think of as your trunk in a traditional sense, followed by, if you go down to tubes, you create tubes that represent sort of the first layer of geometry under that. And then your tubes generate other things, which you can see under growth, such as branches, twigs, leaves, flowers, and buds. And this is the order that it goes in, is number 1 stroke, number 2 tubes, number 3 is branches, then twigs, then leaves, then flowers, then buds. And so each hierarchy is going to usually sprout from the previous level of hierarchy. And all that they do is they have, after that, certain algorithm changes for how they distribute. So for instance, twigs are going to be something that appear on both sides, whereas leaves generally are right off to the end. Now, the reason this is important to know is if you understand it, you can use a very primitive paint stroke to end up making a pretty good tree that is still nice and low poly, such as this one, which is only 400 faces. So let's try and make this. And I prefer to make my trunks by hand because that's sort of the first place that you get a lot of the character from your tree, and you have to be something that's a little better than an algorithmic computer machine. So you have to have an artistic touch, and the trunk is one of the ways that you end up making a tree that says something. So if I hit the CV tool, and again that's create CV curve tool, I can start making a curve. I'll hit X to hold it there. These are not where the curve is going to end up being placed because they're Bezier handles, so they're going to sort of, maybe I'm wrong. Let's reset this curve. Create CV curve. There we go, 3 cubic. So as I was saying, you can create a curve like that. And then you can toggle between object mode. Once you hit enter, you can toggle between object mode and Bezier mode, just like with an object with F9 and F8. So here I can start to modify these. And you'll notice they don't specifically place it, they sort of algorithmically place it. And so now we can start to get something that looks a little organic and tree-like, right? Next up, you're going to create an object that's going to extrude outward and sort of be your trunk. We can largely ignore it once we do it, but it's good to have it out there. So I go create NURBS primitives circle. We're going to create a circle. Let's move it out here and then go into its shape node. So I want this to be linear, and I only want it to be 6 segments. It's in a trunk that is only on 6 sides. I'll rotate it on the x-axis 90. Now if I select this, followed by selecting this, I'm actually going to move these to a separate layer so you can see it a little better. I can now select, let's slow that one. That, and then this. And we want to go to Surfaces, Surfaces, Extrude. This doesn't look very good, but we have to change some of the settings first. So the first thing I'm going to do is, in the geometry, which is the NURBS tessellate node, I'll change its V number to 8, and that's going to up the amount of times it has something to divide. And then under the extrude, I'm just going to scale it down. You'll notice that it doesn't quite fit the whole curve. You can end up fixing that by, under the extrude node, using the rotation value. But that does make it a little high poly, so I'm going to go back to the NURBS tessellate node and reduce that V number until it's something like that. You might want to try scaling it more, but what you can end up doing is select your original NURBS curve, select all these, and scale it down a bit. Now we still have this node here, which is this curve, and this curve is going to be a useful tool because it'll both modify our trunk geometry and modify our curves once we make it. So this trunk is our manual thing, and now we're going to use the curve to at first generate what looks like a stroke in itself, but it's actually just going to be a stroke that later generates branches. So I have this curve selected, and I go to the rendering menu to get our paint effects menu, and then under paint effects I am going to choose, under curve utilities, attach brush to curves. And that's going to generate a brush using whatever our current paint effects one was. So I will undo that. And instead I'm going to reset my brush in paint effects to reset template brush. Now when I do that, hide my template mesh, paint effects, curve utilities, attach brush to curve. Now at first it looks like we just drew a paint effect, but we're going to end up changing that once we add some other fancy things. I really highly recommend that you only work on one part of a paint effect at a time. Otherwise, there's too many inputs that affect each other, and it gets very confusing very fast. The first thing we're going to look at is under the birch blowing light, which is not the name of it. We're going to add tubes, and when you do that, you'll notice that there's these things. And this is really useful because now we can start changing them so that we can tell whether they're causing us problems or not. So before we ever get to adding branches or leaves, we're going to mess with these. So I would start by setting them, you want as little information causing you trouble as possible to begin with. So I'm going to start by trying to make all of these very similar. And down here in the width scale node, you can find a lot of that. So if I set this all to 0, you'll notice that it largely points in one way. If I set this to 0, 1, 1, it largely points along that stroke. Also, a long path is going to be very different from a long normal. So let's see if I can get this to look right. I'm also going to go into tubes, and I want to change the amount of tubes. So I'll change this to 10 and random to 0. You want to add random as a last step once you know what you're messing with. Now if you mess with these, you can finally start to get something. You can actually type numbers in, even if it looks like you can't do something with them. So, using something like that, where I type the numbers in manually, I can start to get these modified. And if we turn back on Paint Effects, you can see what settings I had for this. I ended up using a long path, -1, 0, -1, -1. And that gave me lines that pointed out, or tubes that pointed out, and were generally flowing horizontally away from their stroke. Which means that when I added leaves, they work as cards that are flat and largely pointing towards the sky. Now, leaves are useful because if you go into their settings under the growth option, you can see that you can change their settings to largely end up just being a flat alpha card. So their leaf base length and width is both set to 1, and down here I think there's very little I did to change their settings. A bit of size random, a bit of facing, face the sun set to 1, and then it's just one leaf per tube. So there ends up not being any tubes. I just use them to represent where my alpha cards end up. And the nice thing about this is that once you have this looking correctly, you can go over here in Paint Effects and generate a mesh from it. And it'll turn all that polygon stuff into a mesh. And if you want multiple pieces of data, you can duplicate this before you do that. And then you have all of these alpha cards. And the nice thing about this is you can clean them up very, very fast. So I will go into edit mode, select them all. And let's look at them in the UV texture editor. This is where UVs get to be really useful, because if you wanted, well, first off, let's turn all of these into quads. Mesh, quadrangulate. Now if you wanted to go through and grab, let's say, the outermost edge of all of these, that would take forever. However, all of their alpha cards all these alpha cards end up having the same faces pointing in the same direction with the same UVs. So what this means is we can quickly clean these up and use it as a starting point to modify it. So if I go mesh, edit mesh, add divisions, that'll cut them all in half. But if I then in the UV editor go to edge mode and select all of these ones, you'll notice they're all the ones in the center. Just like how selecting all of these ones are all the edges that are on the bottom. So if I wanted to do something like this tree, where I pulled it down so that you have that swoop of the weeping boughs, you can end up doing something where I'll select these ones, click drag, shift click drag, and control delete to delete components. So I've made it simpler, and now I can select that way, and now I can move them downward, and I want to move all of them downward on their individual downward angles. So I will go edit mesh, transform components, And we can start playing with these. See, just a little bit of a roof going on. And when we end up adding that material, everything ends up working out. Ugh, that's an old one. Make sure that when you're designing things with alpha cards, you make your cards bigger than you think they need to be, because they end up being about 25 to 60% blank. And so it's important to plan ahead for the size that they're actually going to take up. And all the time you see in 3D these trees with these teensy little leaves, and they just look crappy. Oh yeah, one other thought, which is, how did I get this nice card? Well, when I was planning this out, I did lots and lots of research on what kind of tree I was going to be looking at. And, you know, if you go into my layers, no, it's not this one. I did lots and lots of research trying to figure out just what this tree is over here. And I even went so far as to go online and look up William Frost Richards on Wikipedia, and then look for trees in Philadelphia, because that was the area he was in, or Massachusetts. And I found out that it's a white weeping spruce, or a weeping white pine. And I just googled lots and lots of images of these trees where it has this distinct downward sort of sadness look to it. Here's a real good one. Now, it's one thing to know what you're looking at, and another to translate it into a texture, but there's no wrong answer except not trying. So at one point, I was like, well, let's do the old-fashioned thing of just grabbing a chunk off of this. And in fact, this original card was exactly that. This is one of the other trees that was in that Maya file. And at one point, I tried, I might have deleted it. I tried making a card out of specifically like lassoing around that, and it just looked bad. But you can actually use paint effects to make assets that you use later. So if you look at Baobake, one of the ones that doesn't have anything in it, this polygonal mesh, still got its paint effects. So this was originally a paint effects, and all I did was start off with the Pine preset, Window, General Editors, Visor. I think it was trees, this one here, and this generated a pine tree, but it wasn't the right kind. However, it just takes a little bit of polishing to make it look correct. So this is also a good example of trying to figure out how the different settings or the different children of a paint stroke work differently. So if you go down here, this has tubes, which are, so it has this starting stroke, and then the tube is what this pine bough considers its trunk. Its branches are then what come off of here, and its twigs are all the little pine needles. And the twigs end up functioning differently than the leaves because they're trying to do that. The leaves are going to be more solitary, more spread out from each other, and oftentimes on the end of something. Whereas twigs are going to come out in an even way, you know, horseshoe fern or pine tree way. So I just started by making one of these. I modified the twig setting maybe they are. These are twigs, and these are leaves. But that's all it is really just a step in hierarchy. So I went into my leaves and upped the length of them and upped their thickness. I went over here and in the strokes I changed the pressure mappings to try and make it start thin and end thick. So I might map this to number of twigs or twig length, something like that. And then lastly, all this was, I took this tree and I hit render. So this is an IPR render. So all I did was this, and then, oh, it's gotta have lights on. I'm sorry, I know what's wrong. I had been messing around with software renderer. I want this to be mental ray. So IPR to get a preview. I'll just do a selection like this. And this renders out a very thick, very lustrous tree bough, which I then ended up just sticking in Photoshop and doing the same process I've already showed, which is so this was my render previously, and I just grabbed that, stuck it in here, there it is. Did the same thing with a lowered or a contracted selection followed by solidify and using an alpha channel. And then ending up using that as my input for my texture cards. Anyways, I think this video is going a little long now. Ugh, 53 minutes.